I had a very close association with Barry Brazelton at the beginning when he was just starting.
Yes.
And I was so impressed, I'm not a medical person at all, with the power of his method, simply using natural processes in the natural capacities of the baby to educate everybody. Now, that suits my philosophy, you know, the idea of well, to quote a Maori proverb, let the child lead the way.
Yeah, no, yes. So I had the opportunity to train in Boston and did have the benefit of being exposed to Barry Brazelton. And you're absolutely right. You know, his reputation, and I don't mean this in any way in a disrespectful way, but rather just to speak to his ability to always be able to identify the intrinsic attributes of an infant and make parents feel good about it, was epitomized by a somewhat, I don't know if apocryphal is the right term, but people used to speak about him as having the ability to even enable parents of an infant born with anencephaly to feel good. And again, I don't mean that disrespectfully because it could be taken in the wrong way, but it's true.
It makes some sense. There is good in an anencephalic child,
Yes,
which is quite amazing. And the other thing, of course, Lou Sander was very important too. And but you know, I don't know, you may not know, but at a very critical time when Barry was developing his pediatric approach, and Jerome Bruner gave him an opportunity which was critical. You gave him support when he would not have easily been able to do what he wanted to do.
I knew that they were colleagues, but I didn't know how important his support was. And the other remarkable thing, I mean, talking about the role of hospitals, is I can tell you in the 1970s, Children's Hospital, Boston Children's Hospital, and I trained there, and I love training there, and I'm forever grateful for the experience there, but it was not friendly to the Barry Brazeltons of the world.
No,
it was focused on hard science, and he was dabbling in a new science that was looked upon with a fair bit of skepticism, even by the professor of pediatrics, who was an internationally renowned neonatologist. So there were interesting dynamics.
For, was it Dworkin? Okay.
Yes.
I've been at the pediatric conference in 2010, 12, and also going this year. And Jack Shonkoffs from Harvard spoke in 2010 or 11.
Yes.
And then last year in Orlando, there was a whole day dedicated to the early child brains and so on.
Yes.
And then I look at this year's program.
Yes.
I mean, there's hardly anything about.
Right.
And and then we had William Sears here recently, and the argument was made that pediatricians really are not very well equipped to look at.
Yeah.
Certainly the program from the AP reeks that there's not a lot of focus.
Yes.
I mean, what about the actual training that pediatricians receive? When, I mean,
right.
And this is pure ignorance for me. How much of attachment theory, neuropsychology does it include these days?
Well, not enough, certainly. I mean, more today, but absolutely not enough. And I agree with your concern. I for a number of years back, actually chaired the American Academy of Pediatrics Program Committee and sat on the program committee for the Pediatric Academic Society's meeting and was impressed with the number of developmental and behavioral topics that increased year after year. And no one is more charismatic or effective in speaking about this than Jack, who was a colleague of mine. We actually trained together and did some early research together. We're being recorded, I don't care. I'm actually disappointed with the extent to which my field has not embraced the opportunity to distinguish itself by focusing on promoting children's optimal healthy development. Now, I've had this discussion with American Academy of Pediatrics leadership, and they will claim that they absolutely are, and they do have an early brain development initiative that actually David Willis whom I mentioned earlier, was either chair or actively engaged in that effort. So they've done some work. But to my mind, and this will get a little bit into the politics, pediatricians feel somewhat under assault due to a whole variety of reasons, including the fact that their ability to uniquely provide care that is superior to that of other providers, like, for example, pediatric nurse practitioners. And by the way, pediatric nurse practitioners are just as good at providing child health supervision care as pediatricians. But what pediatricians and what our parent organizations have failed to appreciate, that it's this opportunity to really embrace a focus on promoting children's optimal healthy development that could be the value added. And it's a message that we are hammering away at, but it's tough to successfully, it's a tough mountain to climb.
May I jump in? I'm sorry to be also negative, especially since we're being recorded, but this is my chance to talk to a pediatrician.
Sure.
The journal Pediatrics has published studies that it would never be published in a psychology journal because they use this intent to treat method where you assume that the group you tell to do something is going to do it, but you don't measure whether they did it or not. And then you assume the group that you don't tell to do anything, the control group, doesn't do what the other group is doing, and then you measure something that's kind of irrelevant. And then there's no difference, and then you make generalizations that this is safe for every baby, and that they've done this with sleep training. And it's just appalling because they're not, anyway, it seems unethical, and I've written letters to them and complained about the ethics of the journal for publishing such very shoddy research, and written blogs about this at Psychology Today and all.
Have you had any responses?
Well, they seem to take the letter was up for a while, and then they took it down, and then we complained, and they put it up again. Some of us wrote a joint letter. Psychologists, developmentalists who study these things. And so anyway, I'm just putting a little seed in your mind to pay attention to those things too. Thanks.
So I've been on the editorial board of Pediatrics in the past. I'm not at present, but I do know the editor very well, and I think that's a really important point, and we'll have further discussion. Yes, no, I agree. And, that's really, this notion of developmental outcomes are complicated, right? That point was made this morning. So we've come to the conclusion as a result of speaking with audiences like this who've given us a lot of great feedback, that we shouldn't be so much focused on developmental outcomes when we look at the efficacy of our interventions, but rather we should be looking at those evidence-based proxies that we know correlate with developmental outcomes. And that's been much better received in the non-pediatric literature than in the pediatric literature. I think the one-to-one correlation, you do an intervention and children's development improves, is held onto as a belief, but it's obviously fraught with hazards.
One more thing about the sleep training. In the studies they do, they just see whether parents stop complaining, essentially, and that's success then. It's not even looking at child well-being at all.
Right.
And lots of infidelity, implementation, and so many problems, and yet they draw the big conclusions.
You could definitely say the same for obstetrics, which is the area that I study. I'm a student anthropologist, and I like to study evidence-based practice and ideas of evidence-based practice in obstetrics. And we actually have an anthropologist named Claire Wendland that she discusses in her paper. She kind of did an analysis of evidence-based care in obstetrics. And there was a paper that was released in the Journal of ACOG. I forget what it's called, but it's their journal, and they the way that they phrased the title of it or the conclusion was 30%. Like, they went through the list of all their best practices and how are they actually implemented, whether or not it's actually practiced. according to what they've decided is best practices, and they phrase it as 30%. We practice evidence-based care 30% of the time, which can also be, or it could also be, we don't practice evidence-based care 70% of the time by their own admission, which is really funny. But I'd like to talk to you more about that afterwards. But my actual question is, I have a general interest in public science literacy. And I'd like to know from each of you, within your field or even within your own research, what is your area of greatest concern in terms of public understanding of your field or your work? Among parents, not journalists.
I'll answer that in a quick way. Is it not coming through? Let's try this. Can you hear my charming voice now? Okay. I'll answer that in a quick way. For me, the biggest concern is we keep on looking for euphemisms for punishment. A way to use power that's disguised as non-power. And it's a great source of frustration. Yes.
So we've been impressed that the media controls what gets out there, right? I mean, parents' understanding is via the media, and the media is unbelievably focused on negative stories. And the positive stories are really, really hard to get into the press and get into the media, regardless whether it's electronic or printed or visual. And it's a vicious cycle. I realize that's what sells news. Not that anybody's buying newspapers anymore, but that's what sells the news. So, but I mean, we have pleaded with reporters and those who control access to the media to enable us to get positive stories out there as to what really works. And there's not much interest. Not much interest. So I think parents' views, the public views, are adversely impacted by what the public is exposed to, right?
Serena, you talked about when we are exposed to positive behavior and moral exemplars, that we are more inclined to imitate, I guess, or at least be good. So now, in this light of the media focusing on the negative stuff, what is your work getting attention from the media, and can you say more about it?
Yeah, so the genetic work got a lot of attention, especially negative attention, with this fatalistic notion that some people are just born psychopaths and there's nothing that we can do about it. Along the same lines, the experience. So people who are born from horrible families have no hope and they're basically doomed. And another source of frustration for me from the neurobiological literature is that when we look at neurotransmitter systems, it's like opening avenues for over-medicating our children when what they really need, as Dr. Dworkin mentioned, is a lot more community support and a lot more resources. This moral elevation stuff, which I'm really excited about, doesn't get nearly as much attention, but I do hope the word gets out, because I was actually pretty heartened to realize that it had nothing to do with genetic predisposition or with parenting, and that this moral elevation is available to everyone, no matter what their early life experiences may be and what their genetic predispositions may be.
There was a study on the radio this morning. 5 days they put kids, I don't know what age, into at school, or they were in the woods for 5 days, and they found that their ability to recognize emotion improved. Surprise, right? Colwyn, did you have any last statements? And we'll have to stop in a couple minutes, so anybody else that wants to say anything, please do.
I just thought.
I have a question for you, Colin, if you,
want
and
to
then you can
ask me a
perhaps
question?
say
Yeah,
what you'd
okay.
like to say anyway. It's a little bit of a pity that the Bowlbys left, because you made one statement saying that attachment theory and looking at the parents just as a secure base that regulates the stress of the child and to some degree supports exploration is not quite rich enough compared to what you see happens between a child and a parent. I would love to both be here, but...
It's been obvious to me from the beginning that, I mean, we were astonished in the late 60s that babies could do things that nobody had ever recorded or talked about. And now parents knew about it, but there was absolutely there had been no study of communication between mothers and their parents when we began. And because I came in innocent, that is, without any kind of professional support, background or anything, but with lots of resources, because Bruna gave me very good resources, I looked at young children not long after our first child was born and saw them as incredibly rich animals. I mean, as a biologist, I saw a behavior which was well worth studying. And it was, Daniel Stern and Mary Catherine Bateson at the same time, quite independently, without a knowledge of each other at all, were making the same discovery. Dan Stern was a kind of eccentric medic, and Mary Catherine Bateson was an anthropologist and a linguist. And I had come from ethology, biology, and it just seemed that there was a huge hole in our knowledge, in the medical knowledge particularly, of the competence of a newborn baby and their interest in things other than just survival. They were active agents, and that they were quite capable of educating their parents, educating them into a new form of communication, non-verbal communication. But I thought of a rather provocative question in Notre Dame while we're here. I don't look at the media now because I just can't tolerate any more of the perversity of the interest in horrible things rather than anything positive. Has the church got an active role in correcting that? Some people go to church. In our village, about half the people probably go to church. I don't know if they ever discuss any of the things to do with health and well-being, spiritual or otherwise. But surely the church offers the possibility of counteracting the media. Do you think that's the case?
I think so. Maybe someone else wants to speak about that. It depends probably on where you attend, where you go to church. I don't think Notre Dame particularly is thinking about the media as in the negative part. It's always aiming for getting attention from the media, so positive attention.
I'm thinking the church does offer us the ability to have a community discussion, local discussion of important things that are important in the life of the people. And that works, in other cultures.
I can speak to it in Illinois. And in Chicago specifically, I feel kind of unfaithful admitting this, but we signed up with 6 Catholic churches so we could get enrolled in a good parochial school. And the competition is so thick there, we would be alternating to going to different churches every Sunday so that we had a presence and could be considered to be admitted. So I felt like I had 5 boyfriends or 6 boyfriends. But we went, and 2 of these schools that we actually went to one and then made a decision to switch to another. Very difficult to get into, but both were offering positive discipline parental groups. The parents self-select and sign up. You would read a positive discipline book and come and discuss on a regular basis, and had it facilitated by someone with varying degrees of social service or counseling background. And I would say at the one school that we're at, where we're staying, and it's just wonderful, they have a deep commitment to responsive classroom, positive discipline, positive redirection. They are just very committed to finding positive ways of reinforcing the child's core sense of goodness. So if there's misbehavior, how can we redirect it. And it's wonderful to see. And I can't say it's a global thing, but it is certainly a model for working well.
I think we have to stop. I think we have to stop because people need to get to the airport, so you can talk individually. How many speakers are going to the airport now? Maybe you can share. Cabs, did you see who raised their hand? Yes, okay. You have one called for? You have a called for a taxi? And so does Paul. Yes, you both have one called then. Yeah, probably everybody can fit. Okay, so let's say goodbye, make our goodbyes then. Thank you so much again for being here and sharing your wisdom.